Do you read anything into the Jays' top high leverage relievers not getting it done in the most important game of the year? Because, like, let's face it, after the trade deadline, they were one of the better bullpens in baseball. They were doing it in an untraditional way, but they were getting it done. But when the chips were down, they didn't. Do you and this bullpen's under contract for next year too. Like there's going to be very little movement there unless they decide to. Do you think they decide to go a little bit higher velo, different direction?
Yeah, I mean that's what works in the postseason. I mean, we saw this with Munoz. We saw this with all the best relievers in the postseason. Is that
Well, we saw it last year too, and they didn't go that way.
yeah. Well, but this bullpen is better than last year's, and I mean this is the point I
Yes.
made today that if there's another incremental improvement on the bullpen from this year, maybe you are talking about an elite bullpen in 2023. I think that's if you were going to talk about one philosophical difference that this team should have. Not that it's a different one than last offseason, because as you mentioned, the bullpen was the huge issue with the team mid-season last year, and it was a miracle that they ended up with 91 wins and a game shy of the playoffs, considering how horrible the bullpen was for basically half the year.
Months.
Yeah, but yeah, no, it's the focus again, and I, time and time again, this front office, and it's really the major criticism you could lob at them is that they haven't they've done lots that has been on par with like the way baseball is going. They've done more shifting than anybody, but as far as the import on bullpens, they haven't gone that way, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they haven't had prospects that have maybe been you know starting pitching prospects that have transitioned into higher velocity, shorter inning relievers. That hasn't happened. They have not produced internally enough swing and miss arms. And yeah, Jimmy Garcia was a nice signing. They just haven't had enough good fortune building that bullpen, and it has to be once again a focus this offseason.
Couldn't agree more.
Can I jump in here, Scott?
I
I just
yeah.
I want to get your thoughts, Ben, on the managerial decision to leave George Springer in the game, because his health and the longevity of having him through the postseason seem to be a priority. Obviously, this is a moot point, anyways, because of how things went. But when we were watching that game, the Blue Jays were up 4-1, and I felt like this is the time where we need to preserve George. Like, we've got a lead. Let's get the lockdown defense out there. We just watched him bang into the outfield wall, making a nice catch. He was grimacing as he comes off the field. I thought, all right, we need to preserve George for the next game. Blue Jays put up like 4 more runs in the bottom of the inning. We're up 8-1, and George Springer goes back into the field. We see the collision. In an alternate universe situation where the Jays win that game, but there's still the collision with Bo, and let's say George Springer is gone for the rest of the playoffs. How much of a decision do you think we're second guessing there?
I mean, sixth inning is pretty early to start bringing in your defensive outfield, right? Like in that regard, the Blue Jays never took anything for granted in that baseball game, despite being up 8-1. They knew the
Mm-hmm.
potential of the Mariners offense, which isn't a great offense, but we know they can get on base and they can hit the occasional home run. And as luck would have it, due up first in the ninth inning, or I guess it was the bottom of the eighth after the Mariners had tied it up, was George Springer's spot. So it ends up being
Right.
Jackie Bradley Jr. So clearly, after that at bat, if George Springer had gotten on base and it was a tie baseball game, they would have lifted him for Jackie Bradley Jr. as a pinch runner, and he would have taken over defensively. Even if the Jays are up the 3 or 4 runs in the bottom of the ninth, I think that's after that at bat, George Springer would have been lifted. Any earlier than that it really feels like you're playing the results, because I mean that's so early in a baseball game. And the Blue
Yeah.
Jays, again, like you're taking things for granted. You're telling the Mariners that we've scored enough. We don't need to score again. And this game is over. And I just
Well-
I don't see at that point in the baseball game making a defensive replacement.
Adam was actually texting me in the 6th inning. They should be taking George out.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I disagreed with Adam at the time. So
I understand the message that sends the Mariners that, we've scored enough runs, we're good. But I also just wonder, what kind of message does that send your own bullpen when you're saying a 7-run lead isn't enough for Tim Meza and Anthony Bass to hold it down? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, George Springer, if truly there was a question about his health at that time, and there should have been obviously a little bit of a question, the guy and finally ends up suffering the injury that removes him from the game in dramatic fashion in the 8th inning. But if it was a situation where you didn't think George Springer could go, or that he was in jeopardy of injuring himself even more, which is hard to imagine, but it did happen. Sure, I just go through the game logs of the season, and the Blue Jays have done some defensive repositioning late in games. And generally, it's not even George Springer being lifted from the game, right? Like, it's Jackie Bradley Jr. going into center field and George Springer moving to right field and Teoscar Hernandez leaving the game. So,
Right.
in this, playing it according to Hoyle, the way the Blue Jays have played it all season long, George Springer's still in the game probably as the right fielder, and it's Teoscar Hernandez that's leaving, and Jackie Bradley Jr. is playing center field, and Tapia's in left.
we really appreciate all of you within the walk-off community. This thing continues to grow and become an animal of its own. It's a little bit overwhelming, but honestly, we love talking Blue Jays baseball and all the interaction that you folks are involved with us. Thank you so much. Discord, feel free to join it. That is always free. The show, or the link is in the show notes. You can follow us on Twitter at Walk Off Podcast, on Instagram, the Walk Off Podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube currently and you're not subscribed, we'd really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button. All the best, everybody. Cheers.